Welcome to Wandering Grey Bruce. I'm your host, Krista McKee. Today, we have ventured to the Greenock Swamp in Brockton, and with us is Shannon Wood, the manager of communications at Saugeen Valley Conservation. Thank you for letting us come here. This is a fantastic spot. It's the first time I've been to the Greenock Swamp. I have to say the boardwalk that we're on is absolutely amazing. It surpasses any boardwalk that I've ever been on. But tell us about the Greenock Swamp. It's absolutely fabulous.
Well, it is actually the single largest forested wetland in southern Ontario. So this is a big one for sure.
Wow.
And as you said, it's located within the municipality of Brockton. It's 20,000 acres in size.
So now, 20,000 acres, I can't even really wrap my head around 20,000 acres. The size would be
incredible.
Like the size of Toronto. It's, you know, when you try to put it in perspective, 20,000 acres is large.
Yep, it's very big. There's no doubt about it. And they know that once upon a time, it was probably about 45,000 acres. We're just surmising, according to the data that we've been able to accumulate, because ever since European settlement, of course, they've dig into each part of the wetland, trying to clear it, that kind of thing.
Right.
But still, we have 20,000 acres left. So we're pretty proud of this feature. So in essence then, Krista, what you can really think about is that it's a 20,000 acre sponge, right? Because it's absorbing water. It releases water very slowly. As a matter of fact, there's a smaller community, Paisley, which is downstream from here because we're on the Teeswater River. And it's interesting because the engineers have figured out that if we were to take this 20,000 acres, just for example, pave it over, that the community of Paisley would flood out almost every year. And that's with dikes. They have dikes there currently now.
Yeah, that's right. They're land berms that are around that community.
Exactly,
right?
to protect it from flooding. So even at that, still it would flood out because of the nature of the Greenock Swamp. We always talk about wetlands and how important they are. The other thing that we see is when you get to Paisley, that's where the Teeswater River runs into the main Saugeen River.
Right.
So what you notice there, which is kind of interesting, is that after a storm, if you go to Paisley, you look to your right if you're heading north, and the main Saugeen River will be dirty, muddy, that kind of thing after a huge rainstorm. However, if you look to your left, and that's where the Teeswater River is coming from, even after a major storm, it'll be running clear. So the power of a wetland in that particular case is just stunning. And it's interesting because some of the slides, some of the information, the historical information on the swamp that we see here has actually gone to huge seminars that are opened up to wetland specialists from across the world. So it's kind of cool.
Exactly. I think today's community has finally, they're starting to realize that it's more than just a swamp, right?
Yes,
because,
or a wasteland.
Exactly, because it's controlling. Like as what you said here, it's controlling. It's a sponge. It's cleaning the water, and it's definitely something that we need and we should be treasuring.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
And you know, recharging a lot of those groundwater systems, which is really what we need. It's interesting. There was a story in the early 1920s, and the municipality at the time, of course, this is way before amalgamation. Of course, at those times, it was a different thought, right? They wanted to drain the swamp and you know, turn it into agricultural land because it would have been very prime,
right?
You know, for
the Holland Marsh. The Holland Marsh, for
was
instance.
once.
Yes,
that's right, exactly. So they petitioned the government for years and years and years that they wanted to be able to dredge it out and to drain it out. Well, finally, they got money for the government to do this. They were at it for you know, over a decade, and so finally they got the funds to do it. So they part of the Greenock Swamp feature is that it's actually in a big bedrock bowl. And part of that bedrock bowl comes up in Chepstow. So they thought that if they dynamited some of that bowl, that what they would do then, in essence, is drain the swamp.
Right.
So they dynamited it. They got all these funds for the government to dynamite it, and then they dredged out part of the Teeswater River in order to facilitate the draining procedure. Well, it didn't drain the swamp. It didn't manage to do that. However, in the process, it drained out people's wells in the local area. They all ran dry.
Wow.
So it just goes to show you what kind of an impact it had. Well, the interesting part of the story here is that then, of course, the residents were all up in arms because their wells were dry. So they petitioned again the government for funding. Of course, now they wanted to correct the problem. So the government gave all the landowners $1.
Oh my gosh. Well, a dollar's not going to carry you very far.
No, that's for sure. Even in the 1920s, I dare to say. Yes, exactly.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, lots of stories. The logging stories of the 1800s. What you see here is part of the runway when this area froze. And basically that was the only time that they could log out the Greenock swamp in the 1800s. And a man by the name of Henry Cargill in 1871 came to this area, a land sale in Walkerton, and bought most of the Greenock swamp.
Wow.
Imagine what his wife had to say.
We won't even go there.
No, that's right.
Just in case.
So he bought this land because he knew that it was rich in white pine. It had vast stands of white pine, which were in high demand for ship masts over in Europe. So he made a very, very good killing on this area. He really did. He logged out 5 million board feet of white pine every year for 25 years.
My word.
So they would wait till the winter time. They would wait till everything was frozen over. And of course, there's stories of the old corduroy roads where the horses had to get through, right? And they would have been loaded with logs. Sometimes they broke through. And if they broke through, really, there was nothing more that they could do.
Wow.
This is really, when you look around here to this bog, it's actually bottomless. So if we took, that's right, it's very common for these areas. So if you took a big stick and you put it, it would go all the way down. So once the horses got stuck in here, it's almost like a quicksand kind of situation where they would struggle, and the more they struggled,
the worse it got. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Tons of stories. And where there had to be people that were brought in to help Henry harvest as well.
Yes.
There would have to be all sorts of fun things that happened, and lots of tales that would go along with it. But did they? I know when I've driven around here, you see different channels, like where they have tried dredging. Is that still something common now? Like, are farmers still wanting to dredge to this area, or is it monitored somehow?
Yeah, it still is. Like, there still is dredging that carries on. But it's more now we find on the outskirts of the swamp. I think through things like this, we're helping people to realize the value of wetlands. So, you know, you look around, you hope people are understanding the reasons why it's important to have vast wetlands like this. So yes, and we monitor it pretty good, right? As a conservation authority, that, you know, if we do see things happening, then, you know, we like to make sure that we're on top of things that go on like this.
Definitely.
So yeah, absolutely, because now it's a treasure. We understand that now, right? So it's very important that we do that.
Yeah. Now, one thing that we did notice coming in that you pointed out was the pitcher plants that are here, and there's special plants that live here just because of it being a bog. So tell us a little bit about the pitcher plants that we walked past. They're very unique. They look beautiful, but they're actually killers. They really are.
They are.
They are.
And good point. They are. They're carnivorous plants.
Yes.
And they're in flower today out in this bog, which is really cool. And they're unique in that a bog is typically acidic and nitrogen poor. So the only way for these plants, these different kinds of plants, to gain nitrogen is by eating insects, really. So the pitcher plant has a big cup, and you're going to see that in a few minutes. And what it is that it's a deep red, and it's actually very stinky. So insects are attracted to it because it looks like rotting meat and it smells like rotting meat.
Right.
So then the plant is smart, right? So it exudes on the top of the cup this nectar, which is very sweet. Yes, exactly. So the insects are drawn in.
The lure.
That's right.
It's the lure.
It's the big lure. Advertising.
Yes.
You know, all in the advertising.
Yeah.
So the insects come in, and then this plant very smartly has all these stiff hairs that point downwards. So as soon as the insect lands on the top of these cups, it's drawn downwards and it can't get out because the hairs all point down.
Right.
So it drives the insects down into the bottom of the cups, which have fluid, water, down to the bottom of the cups. As soon as the insect gets down there, it drowns, and then the plant emits these enzymes that will break that insect down, and then they'll absorb the nutrients from that insect. So beware.
Beware. So don't let your children run loose just in case they fall in.
Not in the Greenock swamp.
Not in the Greenock swamp.
Man-eating plants.
Man-eating plants. But there's other unique plants here as well. I noticed there was a couple irises here, but the plant life is one thing, but the what type of animals or reptiles would they see when they came out here onto the dock?
It's interesting, because there was a huge study done in the Greenock swamp. Because it's so big, it took 10 years to do the study by Joe Johnson, and who's a renowned botanist and wildlife specialist. And he found out that there were 22 species of orchids in the swamp alone.
Wow.
And 11 birds of prey, 8 of which nest here. Now that's quite unusual because birds of prey need a huge area.
They usually have a block that's theirs, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
They're birds of prey. They need lots of space. So in that case then, to get 8 which nest in an area like this in really southern Ontario is quite unusual. So of course it's a class 1 wetland and one of the most diverse natural areas in Grey and Bruce counties. So it's a pretty special place.
It's a very special place. Now, a lot of people, if they brought their family out here, they're going to want to see snakes, right? Especially if you've got a family of boys, they want to see some snakes. So usually this type of boardwalk, they'll be laying out, sunning themselves. So you have your typical water snakes, probably.
Yes, and garter snakes, of course, too.
Yeah.
They say that there are fox snakes, there are reportings of them, but I haven't seen any myself. And fox snakes are typically a southern Ontario species too, as you know, more of a Carolinian species.
Yep.
And that is the interesting thing, actually, Krista, about the swamp is that, so it has a lot of Carolinian species, which are typical of southern Ontario, but it also has boreal species, which of course exist more to the north of us. So we get both kinds of species here, which makes it even more diverse.
Very unique, very unique,
Yeah, it's a cool place.
It is a really cool place. So we're going to take a short break here, and we're going to get into some really cool folklore that goes along with the Greenock swamp and bootlegging, which is really quite very interesting as well. So don't go away, we'll be right back. So welcome back to Wandering Grey Bruce. We have changed our location from the boardwalk at the Greenock swamp, and we've now moved over to the south side. Please correct me. I'm so lost right now, Shannon. I've totally lost my direction. I don't even know whether I'm going to make my way home or not.
No problem.
So where are we?
We're actually right in the middle, about as close to the middle of this 20,000 acre swamp as you could get.
Okay.
So we're right in the bowels.
The bowels of it.
Yes.
So we started in Cargill, and now we went through Chepstow, and we have the wetland on both sides of us. But the reason why we've stopped here is because of the canals that are behind us that have an amazing history and folklore about it. So you were mentioning on the way here the amount of work that took place here. So just kind of refresh us.
Phenomenal, because Henry Cargill, we're going to go back to him for a second, in the 1800s when he was logging this vast area. And the whole area in terms of water level was about 2 meters higher than what it is today. Well, the difficulty for Henry was getting the logs out, right? How do you get the logs out of this massive area? And of course, he had to do a lot of the logging in the wintertime. However, it was still an issue with him. So he hired approximately 100 men. And what they were responsible for doing, if you can believe this or not, was to dig a canal through the middle of the swamp. Now remember, the water levels are 2 meters higher. One concession to the south of us, one concession to the north of us.
So that's
by hand.
3 miles approximately.
Well, that's right. That's
about
right.
3 miles.
Exactly. So they did it by hand, and which I find phenomenal. And of course, the folklore of it is that they say that the men at the time would have a certain section. You know, we talked about this earlier. They'd have a certain section that they had to dig for the day, and their backs would be black with insects, just black, because you can imagine trying to dig this by hand. Now, if you look behind us, you can see the canals. However, imagine how wide they would have been over 150 years ago,
Well,
right? When
the size of the trees. Right?
Yes.
Let alone the size of the
Yes.
trees that they're trying to get out of the swamp, right? We had talked about the white pine
That's
in
right.
the previous section. So once you cut them down, you have to be able to transport them, right?
Exactly.
And we're
Exactly.
talking the 1800s, horses, etc.
That's right.
And they weren't cutting them down with chainsaws either. They were using those good old...
The old, that's right, exactly. So
Yeah.
all manpower. So the idea is that Henry thought if he could lower the water levels, right, 2 meters, which he did when the canals were all dug, and the canals, by the way, float this way, right toward the Teeswater River. So they float south. It's hard to kind of imagine. You always think they should go the other way. So then what would happen is all during the winter, they would pile the logs up along the canals.
Right.
And then as soon as the water levels got higher in March, whatever, then they would pile all the logs into the canals where they would float on down to the Teeswater River, and they connect up with the Teeswater River, and then they'd float all the way down to Cargill where they would be processed. There was about 5 mills there that used to process them.
Right,
So
okay.
either that or they'd be loaded onto trains onto the nearest dock, and they would head across, go all the way through the Great Lakes and head across the ocean. So, you know, there was many of the Greenock swamp white pines that were used in the European ships at the time.
Right. So Henry hired 100 people, and where did these 100 people stay?
Well, that's a good question, Krista, because what happened was he made up 3 camps, various camps, and from what we understand, there was a local camp, there was a High German camp, and North American, because it was work. So people came from all over the place.
Oh, right, because where are you going to find 100 people?
Exactly.
Exactly,
So-
because this area is just
Exactly.
getting discovered, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So
Okay.
he had to bring them all in, and it was work. Now, mind you, you worked 6 days a week from sun up to sundown, right,
Right.
to do this, and you would get $14 a month.
Oh, wow.
That was your
14
pay.
a month.
But you got fed, you had
Yes.
lodgings, which
Well, that's true. Yeah.
yeah, as crude as they would have been, right? You would have had just bare framed shacks, basically.
Yeah.
But the local people were the cooks, and the women, of course, you know, they'd be hired to do the mending and the cooking and things like that. And the story goes, of course, with all these men being infiltrated to
Oh,
the
dear.
area. That's right. That
Yes.
occasionally an oops would happen. But the story goes is that, you know, the priests at the time, the clergy, that they were very, very important, and they had a lot to do with your lives back then. So, you know, if one of the local women got pregnant, found herself with child, then the rumor goes is that, you know, the clergy of the area would track down the father and to be
Okay.
and say, you will honor your commitment. So, you know, the stories of the swamp just abound, and that's what makes it so interesting.
Oh my goodness. Now there's another story that Shannon mentioned is bootlegging. And that's a touchy subject. Bruce County was wet with lots of alcohol. So I've been told, not that I would know a whole lot about that, but anyway, Owen Sound was always the opposite. So Owen Sound stayed dry until the early 70s, 1970, which really isn't that long ago. As far as I'm concerned, it's not that long ago. But bootlegging was huge here.
Well, you can imagine 20,000 acres of which to hide, right?
Oh
Of
my
which
goodness.
to hide.
Yeah.
But think about it, because, I mean, you can look and see how thick it is behind you. And imagine you're a local farmer in the area, and you could make a good buck off of moonshine if you had the good stuff, if you made the good stuff.
Okay.
So you could probably make in one night what you would make for a month on a regular pay. So it was worth taking the risks
Right.
because the fines were big. But imagine you would have to literally put all the supplies on your back, right?
Right.
And imagine the supplies it took to make moonshine.
Well, usually corn.
Oh,
or,
you
or
know,
some
you've got, that's
wheat,
right, corn
something.
and sugars and you know, all that stuff that you had to carry on your back. And let's face it, when you are out here at 10 o'clock at night, you can't see your hand
No, you
in front
wouldn't,
of your
no.
face.
No.
So these guys would have to troop on somewhere in the bowels of the swamp because, of course, they didn't want to get caught, right? And they would spend all night making their prize moonshine, right? And then they'd have to go back to their day jobs,
Right.
farming or whatever they were doing. And I'm thinking, how did they do it? You know, how did they do it? Well, there's stories, of course, that if you didn't do it right, you could poison somebody.
Well, yeah, you could. Alcohol poisoning.
Alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, alcohol poisoning.
And methanol if you didn't do it right. So Cargill, of course, where all the logs went, and it was such a booming place at that time. Well, they had a funeral parlor there in town too. So I guess if you didn't survive the moonshine, then they just process you just down the road.
Down the road. You go. Oh my God. So they would be selling moonshine to local people.
For the most part. Yeah, for the most part. And when you read the newspapers from the day, you know, oh, we're so much better as a dry community, you know, how dare they produce moonshine in other communities. And the funny thing is when you start doing your homework, you figure that every other house was into moonshine production of some kind.
Well, yeah.
So it's quite funny. And then people had special hiding places in their driveways, right? Little trap doors. And there was a famous...
So they could do like a pickup drop-off.
Exactly.
Drop off their money, pick up their supply.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And they would, you know, they played cat and mouse. There was a local cop that was very, very famous, and he was named Otto McClevis. He went on to become a judge in Owen Sound, but he was very, very famous, and he was huge, they say, like 6'6". And if he caught you, you were in big trouble.
Wow.
Yeah, so, I mean, he was the old-fashioned, you know, hanging out the window with his gun, you know, bang, bang. You think of the old 40s movies and 30s, and that was the kind of cop he was. So they would howl because some of these local people would have trap doors in their driveways or their barns or their houses. They'd have all these hiding spots, and they would chuckle and tee-hee because a lot of times Otto McClevis is standing right on top of the hideaway, and he doesn't realize what they are. But
exactly.
Yeah, from what we understand, he was very, very strict.
Wow.
So, yeah, you didn't want to tangle with Otto McClevis.
No, you would not. No. Now, something else that I read was a green light.
Yes.
Well, I know as soon as I read about the green light, I automatically thought of Sheldon off The Big Bang Theory and the Green Lantern and all that. But there's something funny to do about the green light. Yes.
Yeah. And when the first surveyors, if you can imagine, came here, and I mean, we're talking swamp. You try to slosh through this as a surveyor, and a lot of the surveyors, of course, were from European countries because their parents, their families would send them over here because it was a job.
Right.
So the young men would get sent over here to work. Well, imagine getting sent over here and having to work and to get assigned to the Greenock swamp. So the story is one of the very, very first surveyors who came to the area. He came here, and of course he had all his tents and gear, and like he should, and he set up, and right next to the Teeswater River, set up his tent, et cetera, and apparently in the middle of the night he woke up to this funny haze across his tent. They would have been canvas at that time, weight at time, but anyway, and this haze going back and forth. So he got out of his tent. Now imagine, you're the only one around for miles, and this green glow just kept floating back and forth through the woods and back and over the river, and so the story goes is he packed up his tent and left right then and there.
Right then,
so right then and there, exactly. But of course, what it was is the gases, right? If you're into a swamp, and there's a lot of decomposition going on, that kind of thing in a swamp, in the waterways. So the green gases are actually a result of that decomposition going on.
So, now I would have never realized. I've never been in a swamp in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah. Not many people have.
Yeah,
so
well, the bugs would carry you away for one. But
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so.
Amazing. So that's the Green Lantern. The Green Lantern
story.
There you
go. So that's the Green Lantern story that
Fabulous.
You hear about, and so that's how it goes. And then if you take a look behind you, you'll notice that in the canals, the water is like a funny color. It's like a brownish, reddish color.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people say, oh, what happened to the water? Well, actually, it's very good water because it's out of the swamp. And from what I hear from the old timers, they drank it for years. So what's wrong with it?
And it was probably the base for the moonshine, right?
Oh, of course it would have been. They said there was nothing like swamp whiskey.
Well, exactly.
So that is actually, the color is because of the tannin from the trees.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's right. That's what the color is.
Well, this certainly has been an adventure. I'm glad that you were able to meet with us and take us on this trip because I would have never made it here. I'd be totally lost. But you have shown us some really unique stuff. The Jack in the Pulpit, Darlene was able to get some wonderful photos of Jack in the Pulpit, bayberry, snake's tongue or rose.
Oh, rose begonia.
Rose
yes,
begonia.
Exactly.
Yes, and the sundew. Like it's just been an amazing trip. So you also offer tours here at the Greenock Swamp. So tell us just a little bit of information if people want to buy a ticket or where they can find out and get involved with such a cool event.
It's hard to believe that anybody would want to come to the swamp, but believe it or not, we run 3 different tours, and the tours, of course, include bus transportation. We do beer and wine tasting. We have actors that are involved to act out different concepts of the history of the swamp, which is really cool. In one, we do the prohibition, which we just talked about.
Right.
You get arrested. We go over to the Walkerton jail. We just have a lot of fun. It, of course, includes a full-course Bruce County Church supper with it as well. Although the tours are canceled for 2020. We're setting up the dates for 2021.
Fabulous.
You can go on Eventbrite and check it out and sign up. We have a lot of fun.
One thing that is behind us though is poison ivy, so please when you do venture out, make sure that you are aware of your surroundings. We don't want to back up any further and end up in the poison ivy. But thanks again. It's been a wonderful trip, and we'll see you again soon on Wandering Grey Bruce. Thanks for joining us.